Hello, this is Kaly with Madison Photography. Today we're going to be looking at editing color back into an eye. So as you can see in the photo up on the screen right now, the eye is nice and colorful. This is the completely finished image with a black background and everything added in. So the technique, it's pretty simple. You could get it done in just a couple minutes. The video is about 15 minutes long, but I also spent just a little bit of time kind of cleaning up around the face. So what we're going to do is we're going to double click on the locked background layer and just hit duplicate layer. And you can just name that whatever. I'm just going to call it eye for the sake of this video. Just keep it simple. And then after we create our duplicate layer, I'm going to kind of zoom in just a little bit so you can get a little bit better idea of what we're working with. And as you can see, the eye is pretty dead looking. The camera really didn't pick up any detail, and as you'll see, there's really no color besides different gray tones and black in it. So when you have an image like this and there's no data to really pull any color from, what I do is I kind of just either go off memory, maybe look at some photos from the owners and kind of find my own color to add in there. So I'm going to bring this down to kind of where the orange and red is, and I'm basically just going to go through and kind of find a color that closely matches the horse's original eye. And I mean, you kind of have to play around with this. You know, if you have a blue eye, shift it out to the blues, look at the different shades of blue. You might have to pull, you know, a couple different shades. Every horse's eye is obviously very different. So not everyone can really just pull one color to add back in. So we found the color. We're going to click OK. And then we're going to use our brush tool. And I'm going to bring the opacity, I'll bring it up a little bit. Just kind of play around and see, you know, how strong of a color it's going to be, because you don't want to completely overwhelm the image and totally paint over it. As you can see, the lights and shadows, those are natural from the opening and the barn doors from shooting the image. So we want to kind of find color just to overlay that's not going to completely darken the eye. So I'm just going to kind of color this in here and, you know, make sure to get it all around the edges, make sure that there's, you know, a nice flow and nothing is really sticking out too much. And as you can see here, there's a little bit of light coming in on the right side of the eye. So I'm just going to pick a smaller brush to go in that area and kind of fill all that in up until the very edge of the eye. And then I'm just going to kind of go in the highlights and clean up the edges just a little bit and make sure everything is colored in pretty accurately. And then once you're done adding the color back in, I always like to darken up the pupil and some of the shadows in the eye. So I'm going to bring the size of the brush up just because it's a little bit of a larger area. And I'm going to bring the opacity up. That way we don't have to do too many layers of black to get it where we want. So, and then you'll probably want to bring the hardness up just to give it a nice a nice crisp line where it meets the color. You don't want it to be too crisp because you don't want it to look super, noticeable, but you also don't want something too soft where it's going to kind of cast shadow into the colored area. So basically, I'm just going to bring this up and kind of color in where the pupil was and maybe darken up some of the shadows where you can see the barn doors and the horse's eye. So, and then I'm going to go in and fill in those shadows, but I obviously don't want them quite as dark as the pupil, so just going to bring the opacity down. And then once that's done, I always like to go in with the dodge tool and I always like to brighten up the highlight and kind of really show the catch light in the horse's eye. That's just personal preference. It's not going to necessarily, make or break an image. But I just like to kind of see where the light source is coming from, and I think it helps other photographers kind of being able to see what light source was used. And then after that, I'm just going to go in and kind of fill in the highlighted areas where the color is to add just a little bit more depth so it doesn't all look quite so flat. Just since in the original eye we had, there was light coming in, so we kind of want to bring that back just a little bit. So then we'll go ahead and zoom out and you can kind of see what it looks like here, all finished up. And then here you can kind of compare the original, and then you're going to have the new eye here. And obviously it makes a pretty big difference in the image and what the horse looks like between the two. So it can really enhance an image, especially if you're going to make it a black background, just because every little detail really stands out for those. And then now I'm just going to kind of go in and clean up around the eye a little bit. And, I usually go in and I'll add a little bit of brightness back in some of the highlighted areas on the horse's face that maybe I want to kind of stand out a little bit more. I always kind of find the eye to be a little bit of a focal point that most people look at, so I always like to just kind of slightly brighten up around it, not too much, otherwise it can look a little spooky, but I always find just a little bit can kind of make a bit of a difference. And then I'll go in and bring up my brush size and highlight on the cheekbone to kind of make it pop just a little bit more. It looks a little bit flat. And kind of just add just a little bit more back into the highlights. I did fix the image up a little bit in Lightroom before I transferred it over here, so some of the highlights kind of got a little bit lost. And then now I'm just gonna go in and kind of clean up a little bit around the face. I have tried the patch tool, and sometimes it works, sometimes doesn't quite do as good of a job as I want to. So sometimes I'll go back in with the clone stamp tool, depending on how the patch tool is doing with whatever I'm trying to fix. So, and then I always recommend using a somewhat small brush size when you're using the clone stamp tool. Otherwise, sometimes you can see repetitive patterns kind of stamped all over the image, whatever you happen to be using the tool on. So just something to keep an eye on. Yeah, so there you could see the pattern kind of repeated too much, so I undid that, and I'll just make my brush a little bit smaller and just go fix that one little spot right there. I'm just gonna kind of check over the image, make sure there's nothing really standing out that maybe needs to be patched over. But he was pretty clean in most of the other images I've already done of him, so I'm not expecting to really find anything. And then I'm just gonna go in and kind of clean up a little bit more around the eye. Probably just zoom in a little bit. There seems to be a little bit of an eye booger there. Yeah, so I'll probably use my clone stamp tool on that. And I also recommend using a softer brush when you use the clone stamp tool, just because sometimes when you use a harder brush, you can kind of see the circular imprint, and that can make it look a little bit funny. And kind of reduce the size just a little bit more. Go in and kind of clean that up just a little bit. You can kind of see the pattern repeating right there. And then that looks pretty good, except for one more spot. Just patch that over. Okay, and that seems to be pretty much it as far as that goes. I still obviously need to finish up the rest of the image, which you saw the finished result at the beginning of the video. Kind of show you the before and after again. So you can really see that the changes were pretty subtle overall, but they really did make a pretty big difference in the end with how the overall image looks. So, and there's plenty of ways you can edit. Not everything has to be done the way it was in the video. But I'm thinking about maybe doing a couple tutorials every once in a while. So if you have any suggestions or anything you might like to see, feel free to leave a comment, and I will probably do it sometime. So thanks for tuning in.